Good evening, dear listeners, and a very warm welcome to you all wherever you are tuning in from tonight. Maybe cozied up in bed, listening from your favorite quiet corner at home, or perhaps relaxing somewhere peaceful with the world, fading away outside. I'm so glad you've joined me here. Take a slow, deep breath. Let your shoulders drop. Maybe pull the covers up a bit higher and feel the day gently slip away. Let the story begin. London fog lay thick upon the city that autumn evening. At 221 B. Baker Street, Holmes sat idle, craving challenge. Then came the urgent knock at the door. The body of Sir Reginald Thorpe, a prominent merchant, had been found dead at London Bridge. His form lay twisted on the muddy banks, apparent drowning after a fall. Scotland Yard saw a simple accident, a slip in the treacherous mist. But Holmes saw a link. The man's boots were impeccably dry, untouched by the river's slime, one link in a chain that would bind a killer. The game is afoot. Chapter 1. The first link. I set down these events as they occurred in the autumn of 1892, when thick fog blanketed London like a grey shroud, carrying the sharp bite of coal smoke and the damp chill of the Thames. At 221 B. Baker Street, Sherlock Holmes lounged in his armchair, restless and bored, his Stradivarius violin untouched amid scattered chemical retorts and test tubes. The coal fire crackled steadily in the grate, throwing warm light across the worn Persian rug and filling the room with the comforting scent of burning coal, mixed with the rich, acrid tobacco from his Persian slipper. I sat opposite, nursing a cup of hot tea whose steam curled upward, its bitter warmth a small defence against the cold, seeping through the window frames. A sudden sharp rap echoed from the street door below, followed by Mrs. Hudson's familiar footsteps climbing the 17 creaking stairs. She entered breathless, cheeks flushed from the fog outside, and handed Holmes a telegram with a worried glance. "Dreadful night, gentlemen," she said. "The hansoms can scarcely see the road ahead." Holmes tore open the envelope, his keen eyes scanning the message swiftly, and that peculiar gleam of interest appeared in them at once. "From Lestrade," he announced, tossing the paper to me. "Sir Reginald Thorpe, wealthy merchant, found dead near London Bridge this morning. Official view. Accidental drowning in the fog. But Lestrade requests our immediate attendance. Circumstances unusual." I read the brief note while Holmes already reached for his Inverness cape and deerstalker. The bitter fog pressed against the panes, chilling the room despite the fire, and I felt a familiar stir of excitement as I pulled on my own coat, its rough tweed rough against my neck. We descended to the street, where a hansom cab waited, its horse stamping restlessly on the wet cobblestones. The driver cracked his whip, and we rattled off through the mist, the cab's wheels rumbling over uneven stones, mingling with the distant boom of Big Ben and the muffled shouts of link boys guiding pedestrians. Holmes sat silent, drawing thoughtfully on his pipe, the strong tobacco smoke curling around us inside the cab, blending with the damp, earthy smell of the fog that drifted in through the open flap. Rain began to patter lightly on the roof, a steady drumming that matched my growing curiosity about the case. We reached London Bridge as the afternoon light faded into early dusk, the great arches looming ghostly in the swirling mist. The Thames flowed dark and sluggish below, its mudbanks reeking of sewage, rotting vegetation, and brackish river water. Constables held back a small crowd of curious onlookers, their lanterns casting weak yellow pools through the fog. Inspector Lestrade met us at the cordon, his bowler hat dripping, his breath visible in the cold air. "Holmes, thank goodness," he said gruffly. "Body's down there on the bank. Looks like he slipped and drowned. But something doesn't sit right." We followed him down the slippery stone steps to the muddy foreshore, our boots squelching in the thick, black slime that clung like glue. The corpse lay under a tarpaulin, and when Lestrade pulled it back, Sir Reginald Thorpe's pale, twisted face stared up at us. His expensive overcoat was sodden, his silk hat crushed nearby. Yet the smell rising from him was not only river mud, but a faint trace of carbolic soap and something sharper, perhaps gunpowder residue on his collar. Holmes knelt at once, heedless of the damp soaking his trousers, and began his examination with that intense concentration I knew so well. The mud on his trousers is black and viscous, heavy with coal dust from the barges, Holmes observed quietly, scraping a sample with his penknife. Such a precise mixture is found only in certain stretches of bank near the commercial wharves, not where a gentleman would stroll by chance. I remembered the affair of the engineer's thumb, where a single patch of peculiar red clay on a man's cuff had betrayed his secret journey to a hidden workshop in the hills, forging the first link in a chain that exposed a gang of counterfeiters. Here, too, the ground had remembered the man's path. This mud tells us he was not drowned here naturally, Holmes concluded. He was placed after death. The link forges strong, Watson. Did you see it form? Lestrade snorted, stamping his feet against the cold. Slipped in the fog, that's all. Witnesses heard a splash and a woman's scream. Some nonsense about a banshee. But Holmes ignored him, turning his attention to the dead man's boots. They were of fine Italian leather, still polished in places, and, crucially, perfectly dry, with no trace of the clinging river mud that coated everything else nearby. The soles were smooth, unmarked by the rough pebbles that gritted under our own feet. Second link, Holmes said, lifting one boot gently. These boots of fine calfskin would absorb moisture instantly, yet they remain dry and clean. In the Musgrave ritual, similar evidence of dry boots, when they should have been wet, revealed a servant's secret midnight excursion across dew-soaked lawns, connecting directly to a hidden family treasure and a murder long concealed. He set the boot down, carefully. Thorpe was carried here after death. Another link in the chain. The connection seems invisible. Can you see it, Watson? I nodded slowly, though my mind still raced to catch up. The bitter cold of the riverbank had numbed my fingers, and the taste of earlier coffee lingered sourly on my tongue. Holmes rose, brushing mud from his knees, while the foghorn moaned mournfully somewhere downriver. As we climbed back to the bridge, he paused, listening. And a third link, the so-called Banshee wail. Witnesses describe it as piercing, timed exactly with the reported splash. Superstition, perhaps, but I suspect artifice. Such engineered sounds reminded me forcibly of the spectral hound on the Baskerville moors, where a carefully timed howl had terrorized a family into vulnerability, chaining fear itself to a calculated inheritance plot. The banshee is no ghost, Holmes said firmly, but a device of the killer. Murder, not accident. What chain would you build from these observations? Dear reader, we returned to Baker Street as full darkness fell, the hansom's wheels clattering loudly over the cobbles in the quiet streets. Inside our sitting room, the fire welcomed us with its crackling warmth, and Mrs. Hudson brought hot tea and sandwiches, whose aroma momentarily drove away the river's stench that clung to our clothes. Holmes ignored food, instead taking up his violin and plucking a few sharp, discordant notes while staring into the flames. I poured brandy, its sweet burn cutting through the chill that had settled in my bones. Holmes set the instrument aside at last, steepling his fingers under his chin. The first link forged, he said quietly. The chain begins. Chapter 2. Forging Connections. The next morning the fog still hung heavy over London, though a pale sun struggled to break through, turning the mist into a damp, glowing veil that carried the ever-present smell of coal smoke from 1,000 chimneys. At 221 B Baker Street, the coal fire burned steadily, its warmth pushing back the chill that crept under the door, while the air held the mingled scents of strong tobacco from Holmes's pipe and the bitter coffee Mrs. Hudson had just brought up on a tray. I sat at the breakfast table, the smooth porcelain of my cup warm in my hands, watching Holmes as he paced slowly before the window, his long fingers steepled under his chin in that familiar attitude of deep thought. "We begin forging the chain today, Watson," he said without turning. "Thorpe's death was no accident, but the motive and the hand that struck remain hidden. We must visit those closest to him and observe what the ground, the boots, and the words themselves, betray." He reached into the Persian slipper for a fresh pinch of tobacco, packed his pipe with deliberate movements, and lit it, sending a cloud of rich, acrid smoke curling toward the ceiling. Our first call was to Thorpe's townhouse in Grosvenor Square. The hansom cab rattled over wet cobblestones, wheels hissing through shallow puddles, while rain tapped steadily on the roof like impatient fingers. The Mayfair streets were quiet, the fog muffling the usual clatter of traffic, and only the occasional foghorn moan from the river reached us. Lady Thorpe received us in the drawing-room, where a large fire crackled in the marble hearth, throwing heat against the chill that clung to our coats. The room smelled faintly of lilac perfume and polished wood. The heavy velvet curtains absorbed the sound of our footsteps on the thick carpet. She was pale, dressed in unrelieved black, her hands twisting a damp lace handkerchief whose soft texture contrasted with her rigid posture. "Reginald left after dinner," she said in a low voice. "He said he had an urgent meeting at the warehouse with Mr. Crowe. His partner. He never came home." Her eyes filled, but she blinked the tears away. Holmes moved to the mantelpiece, studying the framed photographs and a small silver cigarette case. "Did he mention any trouble with the business?" he asked. She shook her head. "Only that accounts were complicated lately." Outside, a hansome's horse stamped on the stones, its harness jingling faintly through the fog. From Grosvenor Square we crossed the city to Southwark, the cab swaying as it passed over London Bridge itself. The Thames below looked black and oily, its surface broken by occasional raindrops, and the smell of river mud and tar drifted up even through the closed flaps. Elias Crowe's warehouse stood in a narrow street lined with similar brick buildings, its loading doors open to the drizzle. Inside the office, the air was thick with the odor of leather hides, imported spices, and damp sacking. Gas lamps hissed overhead, casting shadows across stacks of crates, and a small coal stove glowed in the corner, offering meager warmth against the penetrating damp. Crowe was a broad-shouldered man of 50, his rough tweed jacket patched at the elbows, his moustache bristling as he rose from his desk. "Terrible business, gentlemen," he said, voice gravelly. "Reginald was here until 10:30. Now, we went over the ledgers. Nothing out of the ordinary. He left for home in good spirits." Holmes walked slowly round the room, fingers trailing over the smooth surface of a ledger, then pausing at a small brass whistle that lay half hidden among papers. "You keep odd souvenirs," he remarked. Crowe laughed shortly. "Old habit from my seafaring days. Nothing more." The fire in the stove crackled, and somewhere outside, a cart's wheels rumbled over cobbles, the sound echoing in the high rafters. Our next visit took us to Pall Mall and the Reform Club, where Thorpe had been a member. The fog was thicker here, gas lamps glowing like blurred moons, and the doorman's breath steamed as he admitted us into the warm, leather-scented hall. Armchairs of dark-worn hide stood before blazing fires. The air carried the rich aroma of cigars and old brandy. The hall porter, an elderly man with a voice like dry leaves, confirmed that Thorpe had not entered the premises the previous evening. "No, sir, not seen him at all," he said, stamping his feet against the cold marble floor. Holmes noted a telegram form on the counter, addressed to Thorpe, summoning him to the warehouse for urgent conference. The paper felt crisp under my fingers when I examined it. Finally, as evening drew on, we called at a modest house in Bloomsbury, belonging to Miss Amelia Vance, Sir Reginald's private secretary. The cab journey was slow, rain drumming harder now, and the streets rang with the clatter of hansoms and the cries of newsboys. Miss Vance's sitting room was small but neat, smelling of fresh ink, carbolic soap, and a trace of lilac scent. A typewriter stood on a table, its keys gleaming under the gaslight, and a small fire burned in the grate, barely holding back the cold. She was a composed young woman of about 30, her dress plain but well kept. Sir Reginald dictated several letters yesterday afternoon, she told us, voice steady, though her hands trembled slightly. He seemed preoccupied, but said nothing of danger. He left at 6 to meet Mr. Crowe. Holmes's gaze fell on a faint reddish stain on the cuff of her sleeve, clay-like, similar to the mud we had seen on the riverbank. "You have been near the warehouses recently?" he asked. She glanced down, surprised. "Only once. Last week. To deliver documents. The mud there clings terribly." The rain beat against the window, and Big Ben tolled distantly through the fog, each stroke deep and solemn. As we returned to Baker Street, the streets were almost deserted, but the fog so dense that the gas lamps appeared as isolated halos. Inside our sitting room, the fire welcomed us with a cheerful crackle, and Mrs. Hudson had left a tray of hot tea and sandwiches. Holmes stood before the hearth, pipe in hand, smoke rising in slow spirals. "Links are forming, Watson," he said quietly. Lady Thorpe's lilac perfume, Crowe's whistle and limp, Miss Vance's stained cuff, the telegram that summoned Thorpe to his death. Alibis overlap and contradict. The chain takes shape. But it is not yet unbreakable. I poured brandy, its sweet warmth cutting through the lingering chill of the day, and settled into my chair. Holmes's powers of observation never ceased to astonish me. Where I saw only scattered facts, he already saw connections forging link by link. Looking back, I should have noticed the significance of that small brass whistle sooner. What chain would you build from these observations, dear reader, before Holmes explains further? What does this evidence tell you? The fire popped softly, sending sparks up the chimney, and outside, the rain continued its steady patter on the window panes. Links forging, the chain takes shape. Chapter 3. The chain grows. The fog persisted into the third day, though thinner now, allowing slivers of weak sunlight to filter through and turn the streets of London into a landscape of soft greys and muted golds. At 221 B Baker Street, the coal fire roared with fresh vigour, its crackling warmth driving back the persistent damp that clung to everything, while the air carried the familiar blend of Holmes's strong tobacco and the sharp, bitter edge of fresh coffee. Mrs. Hudson had left on the side table. I stood by the window for a moment, watching raindrops trace slow paths down the glass, their cold touch visible even from inside, before turning to find Holmes already dressed in his Inverness and deerstalker, pipe clenched between his teeth. "We return to the scene, Watson," he said, voice low and decisive. "The riverbank has more to tell us, and the chain cannot grow without fresh links." He tapped the bowl of his pipe against the mantel, sending a small shower of ash into the grate, then reached for his magnifying lens. The 17 steps creaked beneath our boots as we descended, and outside, the cobblestones glistened darkly, slick and treacherous underfoot. A hansom cab splashed to a halt at our signal. Inside, the leather seat was still warm from its previous occupant, but the fog's chill had already begun to seep through my coat. The journey to London Bridge took longer than usual, the horses' hooves clopping steadily through puddles while hansoms and drays passed like ghosts in the mist. Big Ben tolled the hour, with deep, muffled strokes that seemed to vibrate through the fog itself, and somewhere on the river, a foghorn gave its long, mournful cry. When we reached the bridge, the tide was out, exposing a wide stretch of black mud that reeked of sewage, rotting fish, and the heavy mineral tang of coal dust washed down from upstream wharves. Constables had kept the area clear, though a few idlers lingered at the railings above, collars turned up against the drizzle. Lestrade met us at the top of the stone steps, rubbing his gloved hands together for warmth. "Nothing new since yesterday." "Holmes," he said, breath steaming. "But the mud's dried a bit. Might show something clearer." We descended carefully, boots sinking into the soft, clinging ooze with a wet, sucking sound. The cold bit through the leather, and I felt the chill travel up my legs as we approached the spot where Thorpe's body had lain. The tarpaulin was gone now, but the outline of the corpse remained faintly pressed into the mud like a ghostly imprint. Holmes dropped to one knee at once, heedless of the damp soaking his trousers, and trained his lens on a series of shallow depressions nearby. "Here, Watson." The prints. They were irregular boot marks, one heel noticeably deeper than the other, and beside them a faint smeared drag line perhaps 2 feet long. The mud had begun to crust, preserving the shapes with surprising clarity. "And observe the asymmetry," Holmes murmured. "This is no ordinary tread. The right heel strikes harder, suggesting a limp, perhaps an old injury or a built-up sole." He scraped a sample of the surrounding mud into an envelope, the black paste thick and gritty between his fingers. "A crucial link," he continued, rising slowly. "Such a distinctive gait leaves a signature the ground cannot erase. I recall the case of the man with the twisted lip, Hugh Boone, the beggar, whose uneven footprints betrayed the secret that he was in truth Neville St. Clair, a respectable journalist, living a double life. The prints connected opium dens in Swandam Lane to a comfortable villa in Kent, forging a chain that unravelled months of careful deception. Here, too, the earth remembers, our killer, or one of them, limps. The bind is tightening. How many links did you spot before this one, dear reader?" Lestrade grunted, unconvinced, stamping his feet to dislodge clumps of mud. "Could be any docker with a bad leg. Thousands about." But Holmes had already moved to a wooden piling that supported the bridge's underside. Caught on a splintered nail was a single short fibre, fine pale silk, torn but still bearing a faint sheen. He plucked it free with tweezers and held it to the light. "Silk scarf, I should think, expensive, and damp with river water, yet caught high enough to suggest it was snagged during the carrying, not the fall." The wind shifted, carrying a fresh wave of Thames stench mingled with distant coal smoke from a passing barge. Rain began again, light but steady, pattering on our hats and turning the mud slick once more. Holmes pocketed the fibre, and then turned his attention to a small object half buried nearby. A brass whistle, no longer than my little finger, its surface tarnished but intact. He lifted it carefully, turning it in his fingers. The metal was cold, smooth, except for faint filing marks near the mouthpiece. "This," he said softly, "explains the Banshee wail." He blew gently into it. A high, eerie shriek cut through the fog, sharp enough to make Lestrade flinch. Acoustic deception. Simple, effective, timed to coincide with the splash the witnesses heard. Such devices were not unknown to me. I thought at once of the hound on the Baskerville moor, where a phosphorus-coated beast and timed howls had terrorized a family into near madness, chaining superstition to a cold-blooded murder for inheritance. Here the principle was the same. Fear as a weapon, sound as misdirection. And we climbed back to the bridge, legs heavy with mud, the cold now deep in my bones. Later, in the chill of the mortuary near Guy's Hospital, the air thick with carbolic and the faint sweet rot of formaldehyde, Holmes examined the body once more. The lips showed a slight darkening, and when he cautiously sniffed close, a trace of bitter almonds lingered. "Cyanide," he confirmed. Administered before the drowning. The chain grows. Poison at the meeting. Staging on the bank. Whistle to simulate the Banshee. Limp to identify the carrier. Back at Baker Street, that evening. The fire burned high. Its warmth, a blessed relief after the river's bite. Mrs. Hudson brought hot tea that steamed invitingly, and I added a measure of brandy whose sweet fire chased the last of the chill from my throat. Holmes stood before the hearth, pipe in hand, eyes gleaming with that peculiar light. The links multiply. Dry boots, mud prints, silk fibre, whistle, poison. Connections form where none seem to exist. I nodded, still marvelling at how swiftly the scattered facts had begun to cohere under his gaze. Looking back, I should have recognized the significance of that small brass whistle sooner. What chain would you build now, dear reader? Before Holmes explains further, can you see the shape it is taking? The fire popped, sending sparks dancing up the chimney, while outside the rain continued its soft, relentless drumming. The chain grows stronger. Logic binds. Chapter 4. Testing the links. By the fourth morning, the fog had thinned to a pale veil, allowing a watery sunlight to gleam on the wet rooftops of Baker Street. Inside, 221B, the coal fire burned steadily, its crackling warmth mingling with the sharp scent of fresh tobacco as Holmes refilled his pipe from the Persian slipper. The air also carried the bitter edge of black coffee Mrs. Hudson had set out, and I sipped mine gratefully, feeling the hot liquid chase away the lingering chill that had settled in my bones from days spent tramping through damp streets. Holmes stood at the table, maps and notes spread before him, his long fingers tracing lines across the paper with deliberate care. "Today, we test the chain, Watson," he said, voice calm but edged with purpose. "Every link must be struck upon the anvil of fact. Weak ones will shatter, strong ones will hold and grow brighter." He folded the maps, donned his Inverness, and we descended the 17 steps together, our boots echoing in the narrow hall. Outside, a hansom cab waited, its horse snorting plumes of steam into the cool air. The wheels clattered over glistening cobblestones as we set off, rain beginning again in a soft, steady patter on the roof. Our first test was at Grosvenor Square. Lady Thorpe received us once more in her drawing room, where the fire roared and velvet curtains shut out the grey day. The room smelled faintly of lilac and wood polish. She sat, very straight, hands folded in her lap. Holmes wasted no time. "Your perfume, madam. Lilac. A glove found near the body bore the same scent. Did you visit the riverbank that night?" Her face paled, but she met his gaze. "Never. I was here all evening. The glove must belong to someone else." Holmes produced the glove from his pocket. Fine kid leather, damp but still soft. She touched it briefly, then shook her head. "Not mine." The link of perfume seemed weak here. Her denial was steady, her hands unshaken. We left with the suspicion that this thread might break under pressure. Next, we crossed to Southwark and Crow's warehouse. The air inside was thick with leather, spices, and the faint metallic tang of coal smoke from the stove. Crow limped forward to meet us, his rough tweed jacket damp at the shoulders. Holmes held up the brass whistle found on the bank. "This was near the body. You keep a similar one on your desk." Crow's eyes narrowed. "Old sailor's trinket. Half a dozen men here have them." Holmes stepped closer. "Your limp leaves a distinctive print. The mud at London Bridge bears exactly that mark. Heavier on the right heel." Crow laughed, short and harsh. "I walk the wharves daily. Of course my prints are there." Yet, when Holmes pressed for witnesses to his movements after 10 o'clock, Crow grew evasive, muttering about ledgers and fatigue. The limp held firm as a link. The alibi wavered. From there, the cab took us to Bloomsbury and Miss Vance's modest rooms. The small parlour smelled of ink and carbolic soap. The The typewriter silent now on its table. A low fire burned in the grate, barely warming the chill that clung to the walls. Miss Vance stood by the window, composed but watchful. Holmes laid the silk fibre on her desk. This was snagged on the bridge piling. Fine silk. Your scarf? She glanced at it, then at the empty hook by the door. My scarf was stolen 2 days ago. I reported it to the police. Holmes nodded slowly. Convenient. And the reddish clay on your cuff, last time we met? From delivering papers to the warehouse the week before. Nothing more. Her voice remained even, but her fingers tightened on the back of a chair. The fibre and stain seemed circumstantial. This link bent, but did not yet break. We pressed on to the city, to the offices of Mr. Hargrove, a rival merchant who had quarrelled publicly with Thorpe over a shipping contract. His rooms were grander. Marble floors, cold underfoot, gas lamps, hissing softly. The air smelled of cigar smoke and old leather. Hargrove, a stout man with a florid face, received us with forced courtesy. Yes, I disliked Thorpe, he admitted, but murder, absurd. I was at my club all evening. Asked the porter. Holmes noted the solid alibi later confirmed by 3 independent witnesses. No limp, no lilac, no whistle. This suspect's link shattered cleanly. Hargrove was eliminated. Our final call was to a mews stable behind Mayfair, where Thorpe's valet, a quiet man named Perkins, lived in a small room above the carriages. The place smelled of saddle soap, hay, and carbolic. Perkins was polishing boots when we entered, his rough tweed coat hanging on a peg. Sir Reginald was a good master, he said softly. I last saw him at 6. Holmes's eye fell on a crumpled telegram, half hidden under a newspaper, dated the night of the murder, from Crow, urging an urgent meeting. Perkins paled when confronted. I only carried messages. Yet he had no limp, no trace of lilac or silks. The telegram forged a new connection back to Crow, but Perkins himself seemed peripheral. This link held only loosely. As evening deepened, we returned to Baker Street. The hansom's wheels rumbling through streets now lit by gas lamps that glowed like yellow moons in the lingering mist. Inside, the fire welcomed us with a cheerful blaze. Mrs. Hudson had left hot tea and a plate of sandwiches whose aroma momentarily drove away the day's accumulated damp and river smells. Holmes stood before the hearth, pipe in hand, smoke curling upward in slow spirals. The tests have done their work, he said quietly. Hargrove is out, his alibi unbreakable. Lady Thorpe's perfume connection weakens without further evidence. Miss Vance's stolen scarf may be genuine misfortune. Perkins is a messenger, not the hand, but Crow. His limp matches, his whistle resembles, his alibi falters, and the telegram ties him to the fatal appointment. The weak links have shattered. The true chain emerges. They're stronger for the hammering. I poured brandy, its sweet warmth spreading through me as I settled into my chair. The day's rapid scenes had left me weary, yet exhilarated. Where I had seen only possibilities, Holmes had struck each one against reality and watched the false ones crumble. Looking back, I should have recognized sooner how decisively Crow's evasion stood out. What would you have discarded first, dear reader? Before the next step, which links still feel solid to you? The fire crackled softly, sending sparks up the chimney, while outside the rain continued its gentle, persistent drumming on the window panes. Weak links shattered. The true chain emerges. Chapter 5. The chain tightens. The 5th day brought a change in the weather. The persistent fog had finally lifted enough to reveal a cold, clear sky above London, though the wind carried a bitter edge that cut through coats and scarves alike. At 221B Baker Street, the coal fire burned high, its steady crackle filling the room with welcome warmth, while the scent of strong tobacco mingled with the sharp aroma of fresh coffee Mrs. Hudson had placed on the side table. And I stood, warming my hands at the hearth, feeling the heat soak through my chilled fingers, when Holmes entered from his bedroom, already in his Inverness, deerstalker in hand. "The chain tightens today, Watson," he said, voice low and charged with certainty. "Crow is the centre now. His limp, his whistle, his evasions. We force the confrontation and watch the links bind him fast." He reached for the Persian slipper, packed his pipe with quick, precise movements, and lit it, sending a cloud of rich smoke curling toward the ceiling. I nodded, pulling on my own coat, the rough tweed scratching against my neck as we descended the 17 steps and stepped out into the crisp air. A hansom cab carried us swiftly to Southwark, wheels rumbling over dry cobbles for the first time in days. The streets rang with the usual clatter, hansoms passing, costermongers calling, the distant toll of Big Ben marking the hour. When we reached Crow's warehouse, the loading doors stood wide, dockers hauling crates under the pale sunlight. The air inside smelled of leather, spices, and the faint metallic tang of coal smoke from the office stove. Crow was there, limping between two stacks of barrels, barking orders in his gravelly voice. He saw us at once and stiffened, mustache bristling. "Back again, gentlemen," he said, forcing a smile that did not reach his eyes. Yet Holmes stepped forward without preamble, producing the brass whistle from his pocket. "This was found on the river bank, beside Sir Reginald's body. You keep an identical one on your desk. Care to explain?" Crow's hand twitched toward his coat pocket, then stopped. "Coincidence. Plenty of sailors carry them." Holmes blew gently into the whistle. The high, piercing shriek echoed through the warehouse, making several dockers pause and stare. "The Banshee wail," Holmes said quietly. "Not a ghost, but artifice. Time to mask the moment of disposal." Crow's face darkened. "You've no proof." Holmes took another step. "Your limp matches the prints in the mud. Heavier on the right heel. The telegram you sent urging Thorpe to the warehouse that night, the cyanide we traced to a bottle in your stores." Crow's eyes darted toward the rear door. Yet for a heartbeat, the warehouse was silent, save for the crackle of the stove and the distant lap of the Thames against the wharf. Then he bolted. He shoved past a startled docker and limped rapidly toward the back stairs, boots thudding unevenly on the wooden planks. Holmes was after him in an instant, long legs covering the ground with startling speed. I followed, heart pounding, the rough texture of crates scraping my sleeve as I dodged between them. "Stop him!" Holmes called, voice sharp. Dockers scattered, confused, while Crow pounded up the narrow stairs to the upper floor, his limp more pronounced now under haste. We pursued through a maze of stored goods, barrels, sacks, coils of rope, the air thick with dust and the smell of tar. Crow reached a small side door opening onto a catwalk above the wharf. He burst through, yet limping along the narrow iron walkway that overlooked the river. The wind whipped cold against my face, carrying the brackish scent of Thames mud and the faint gunpowder tang from a nearby smithy on the bank. Below, the water churned, dark and restless, slapping against pilings with rhythmic force. Holmes gained ground, closing the distance, with relentless strides. Crow glanced back, face pale, then tried to vault a low chain across the path. His bad leg buckled. He stumbled, caught himself on the railing, but the momentum carried him forward. The chain rattled loudly as he fell against it. Holmes reached him in 3 strides, seizing his arm in an iron grip. "Enough!" he said, voice calm despite the chase. Crow struggled briefly, breath coming in harsh gasps, then sagged, defeated. I arrived panting, the cold air burning my lungs. From the warehouse below came the shrill whistles of police. Lestrade had been waiting with constables, as Holmes had arranged by telegram earlier. They swarmed up the stairs, boots clanging on iron, and secured Crow with handcuffs that clicked shut with finality. The wind moaned through the girders, carrying the mournful note of a distant foghorn, even though the mist had cleared. Back on solid ground, Lestrade took charge, his breath steaming in the cold. Holmes produced the whistle once more. "This device," he explained, "is the crucial link, a simple acoustic trick, high-pitched, timed to coincide with the splash the witnesses heard. Such contrivances remind me forcibly of the Gloria Scott affair, where a coded whistle signal passed between mutineers aboard ship, chaining their past crimes to a present blackmail plot across years and oceans. Here, the principle is the same. Misdirection through sound, fear through superstition. The Banshee was man-made." Crow, wrists bound, glared at the ground. "You've got nothing solid," he muttered. Holmes leaned closer. "We have the poison. Cyanide traces in your stores and on Thorpe's lips. We have the limp matching the prints. We have the telegrams summoning him to his death, and we have motive. The ledgers I examined yesterday show discrepancies. Funds siphoned over months. Thorpe discovered the embezzlement. He confronted you that night. You poisoned him, staged the fall, used the whistle to simulate the ghostly wail. The chain is complete." Crow's shoulders slumped further. In a low voice he began to speak, halting admissions of debt, of panic, of the fatal meeting in the warehouse office, where a cup of tainted coffee had ended Thorpe's life. The constables led him away, his uneven footsteps echoing across the yard. We returned to Baker Street as dusk fell, the hansom's wheels clattering through streets now lit by gas lamps that cast long, steady glows. Inside, the fire welcomed us with its familiar crackle. Mrs. Hudson brought hot tea that steamed invitingly, and I added brandy, whose sweet warmth spread through me like relief. Holmes stood before the hearth, pipe in hand, eyes gleaming with quiet triumph. "The chain tightens," he said softly. "No escape now." I nodded, still catching my breath from the chase. Holmes's logic had drawn the noose step by step, link by forged link. Looking back, I should have seen Crow's limp as the decisive thread sooner. What would you have done when he ran, dear reader, before the final binding? Which observations sealed his fate for you? The fire popped gently, sparks rising like tiny stars, while outside the wind whispered against the window panes. The chain tightens. No escape now. Chapter 6. Links to the past. With Crow. Safely lodged in a cell at Scotland Yard, the sharp winter light of the 6th day pierced the remaining haze over London, turning the city into a crisp panorama of smoke-blackened chimneys and wet slate roofs. At 221B Baker Street, the coal fire burned with steady vigour, its crackling warmth a constant companion as the room filled once more with the rich scent of Holmes's tobacco and the faint bitterness of cooling coffee left on the tray. I sat in my usual armchair, legs stretched toward the hearth, feeling the leather warm against my back while the rough tweed of my coat still carried the chill of the morning streets. Holmes stood at the table, papers and ledgers spread before him like the pieces of a dissected puzzle. His long fingers moved methodically, turning pages, tracing columns of figures with a pen whose ink left faint shadows on the smooth paper. "The physical chain is forged, Watson," he said without looking up. "Now we must examine the deeper links, the history that binds motive to act. Crow's past will reveal why a respected merchant turned to poison and deception." He reached for a small stack of documents delivered earlier by messenger from Lestrade, old court records, shipping manifests, and a yellowed dossier from the city police. The papers smelled faintly of dust and old ink. Their texture crisp yet brittle at the edges. Holmes settled into the opposite chair, pipe in hand, and began to read aloud in his precise, measured tone. "Elias Crow, born 1842 in Stepney, orphaned at 12, apprentice to a shipping clerk, rose quickly through diligence and, apparently, sharp practice. In 1868 he was implicated in a minor forgery case, falsified bills of lading to skim profits from a Caribbean sugar run. Charges dropped for lack of evidence, but the firm dismissed him quietly." Holmes paused, drawing on his pipe, the smoke curling upward in slow spirals. He resurfaced in 1875 as junior partner in a small import house, specializing in leather and spices, precisely the trade he pursues today. No further convictions, but whispers of creative accounting followed him. I leaned forward, the fire's heat warming my face. So he has form. But how does that connect to Thorpe? Holmes tapped a ledger page. This one. Thorpe's private accounts, seized from the Mayfair house. See here. Irregular withdrawals over 18 months, small at first, then larger. Always signed by Crowe as co-authorized. Thorpe noticed there are marginal notes in his hand. Query Crowe, R.E. £400 missing, 14th of March, 1992. The final entry, dated 2 days before the murder. Confront EC tonight. The room was quiet, save for the soft pop of coal in the grate and the distant clatter of a hansom passing in the street below. Holmes continued, voice steady. Crowe's motive was not mere greed, but survival. The warehouse faced insolvency, bad shipments from India, a fire in the bonded store last spring, creditors pressing. Thorpe, the senior partner, controlled the purse strings and had begun to suspect systematic embezzlement. Crowe could not repay what he had taken, over £9,000 in total. Murder was the only path left to silence the discovery. I sipped the last of my coffee, now cold and bitter on my tongue. And the staging, the riverbank, the whistle. Holmes set the ledger aside and reached for another document, a faded patent application from 1881. Crowe once designed acoustic signaling devices for merchant ships, whistles of variable pitch to cut through fog. The Banshee wail was no random superstition. It was his own invention repurposed. He blew it from the bridge after dragging the body down the steps and ensuring witnesses heard a ghostly scream rather than the sounds of a struggle or a heavy fall. Such ingenuity in misdirection recalled to my mind the curious affair of the stockbroker's clerk, where a young man was lured into a false position by a criminal brother who used forged credentials and elaborate ruses to conceal a long history of fraud. In that case, the past frauds chained the present crime tightly. The brother's earlier forgeries in Australia had taught him exactly how to mimic legitimate business, linking old deceit to new murder across continents and years. Here, too, Crowe's youthful brush with forgery had schooled him in the art of false appearances, false accounts, false alibis, a false banshee to cloak the truth. Holmes rose and paced slowly before the fire, shadows dancing across his sharp features. Every link now connects. The limp that left prints in the mud, the whistle that mimicked a ghost, the cyanide from his own stores, the telegram that summoned Thorpe to his doom, the ledgers that prove theft, the history that proves capacity for deceit. Past and present are one unbroken chain. I nodded, marveling once again at how Holmes had drawn these disparate threads into a single, unyielding cord. The fire crackled softly, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney, and outside, a light rain began to tap against the window panes, its rhythm steady and patient. I thought of Lady Thorpe, now free of suspicion, and of Miss Vance, whose stolen scarf had been no more than coincidence. Even Perkins the valet had been merely a conduit for messages, not a conspirator. Holmes stopped pacing and returned to his chair, steepling his fingers under his chin. Tomorrow, Lestrade will gather the remaining parties at the yard. I shall lay the chain before them, link by link, until Crowe has nowhere left to hide. His eyes gleamed with that peculiar light I knew so well, the satisfaction of reason prevailing over deception. I poured us each a measure of brandy from the tantalus, its sweet warmth cutting through the lingering chill of the day. The glass felt smooth and cool in my palm as I raised it in a silent toast to the work completed. Holmes's powers never ceased to astonish me. Where others saw only a tragic accident and scattered superstition, he had uncovered a calculated crime rooted deep in one man's past. Looking back, I should have recognized earlier how Crow's seafaring background and his casual mention of old sailors' trinkets pointed directly to the whistle. What hidden history would you have suspected first, dear reader, before the final explanation? Which link from the past do you think bound him most securely? The fire settled into a steady glow, and the rain continued its gentle drumming outside, a soft counterpoint to the quiet that now filled our rooms, past and present, one unbroken chain. Chapter 7. The Complete Chain. The seventh day dawned cold and bright. The last traces of fog banished from London's streets, leaving only the sharp bite of winter air and the clean scent of frost on the cobblestones. At Scotland Yard, the atmosphere was tense and formal. Gas lamps hissed along the corridors, with their light reflecting off polished stone floors that felt cold, even through thick soles. Inspector Lestrade had arranged the gathering in a large interview room near the back of the building, where a coal fire burned in the grate, crackling steadily and throwing warmth against the chill that seeped from the high windows. The air carried the mingled smells of coal smoke, carbolic soap from the cells below, and the faint bitterness of institutional coffee served in thick mugs. Lady Thorpe sat at one end of the long table, dressed in quiet black, her hands folded calmly in her lap. Beside her was Miss Amelia Vance, composed and watchful, a small notebook resting before her. Perkins, the valet, occupied a chair near the wall, uneasy but silent. Mr. Hargrove, already cleared, had not been summoned. At the far end sat Elias Crow, his wrists manacled to a ring bolted to the table, his broad shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the scarred wood before him. Lestrade stood near the door with two constables, while Holmes and I took places at the head of the table. The fire popped softly, sending sparks up the chimney, and outside a distant hansom clattered past, wheels rumbling over cobbles. Holmes rose slowly, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the room. He placed a small bundle of evidence on the table. Boots, whistle, silk fibre, ledger pages, telegram, the brass whistle, and arranged them with deliberate care, each item a visible link in the chain he had forged. "Gentlemen, ladies," he began, voice clear and unhurried. "Sir Reginald Thorpe did not die by accident. He was murdered. I shall now lay before you the complete chain, link by link, so that no doubt remains." He lifted the first item, the pair of polished boots found dry on the riverbank. Physical evidence, the foundation. These boots bear no trace of Thames mud, yet the body lay on the foreshore. Italian calfskin absorbs moisture instantly. Their dryness proves Thorpe was carried to the spot after death. Next, the mud prints beside the body. Irregular. Right heel deeper, matching exactly the custom sole of Mr. Crow's boots. He pointed to Crow's feet beneath the table. "The limp is unmistakable. The ground remembered every uneven step." Crow shifted, chains clinking faintly, but said nothing. Holmes moved to the ledger pages. Timeline links. Thorpe's private accounts show systematic embezzlement. £9,000 over 18 months, authorized by Crow. Marginal notes in Thorpe's hand grow increasingly urgent. Queries, demands for explanation. The final entry, 2 days before death. Confront EC tonight. The telegram found in Perkins's room, sent by Crow, summoned Thorpe to the warehouse at that very hour. The meeting was not business. It was judgment. He lifted the small brass whistle, holding it up so the gaslight caught its tarnished surface. Witness links. Several people near London Bridge reported a piercing, woman-like scream, followed by a splash. Not a banshee, but this device. Crow's own invention from his seafaring days. Blew once from the bridge after disposal. It mimicked ghostly terror, ensuring the death would be dismissed as accident or superstition. Lady Thorpe drew a sharp breath. Miss Vance's fingers tightened on her notebook. Holmes continued, without pause. Motive links. Crow's history. Forgery in youth. Dismissed quietly. Later whispers of creative accounting. The warehouse faced ruin. Bad shipments. Fire losses. Creditors closing in. Thorpe's discovery of the theft left only two paths. Repayment impossible. Silence essential. Poison was chosen. Cyanide, traces found in a bottle in Crow's stores and on Thorpe's lips, administered in coffee during the meeting, death swift and quiet, body dragged to the bank, whistle sounded, illusion complete. He placed the final item, the crumpled silk fibre, the last connecting link, snagged on a piling during the carrying, not Miss Vance's stolen scarf as first suspected, but a remnant from Crow's own pocket handkerchief, identical weave and dye confirmed by laboratory comparison this morning. A small oversight, yet but decisive. The room was silent, save for the fire's steady crackle and the faint clink of Crow's chains as he shifted again. Holmes stepped back, eyes sweeping the table. Every link accounted for. The boots prove staging. The prints prove the carrier. The ledgers and telegram prove the summons. The whistle proves deception. The cyanide proves murder. The history proves capacity. The fibre proves presence. No thread can be broken. The chain is complete and unbreakable. Crow lifted his head at last. His voice came low, hoarse. I never meant... It was panic. He threatened the police. I only wanted to stop him talking. The words hung in the air, flat and final. Lady Thorpe turned her face away, a single tear tracing her cheek. Miss Vance closed her notebook with a soft snap. Perkins stared at the floor, Bill's shoulders sagging in relief that his own minor role had been clarified. Lestrade cleared his throat. Elias Crow, I arrest you for the murder of Sir Reginald Thorpe. The constables moved forward. Crow rose without resistance, chains rattling as they led him toward the door. He paused once, glancing back at Holmes with something like dull respect, then was gone. The room emptied slowly. Lady Thorpe thanked Holmes in a quiet voice, her hand briefly touching his sleeve. Miss Vance offered a small, grateful nod. Lestrade lingered to shake Holmes's hand with grudging admiration. You've done it again, Holmes. Scotland Yard owes you. We stepped out into the cold afternoon air, the sharp scent of frost mingling with distant coal smoke. A hansom waited. As we climbed in, the wheels clattered over the cobbles, it carrying us back toward Baker Street. Inside the cab, the leather seats were cold, but the satisfaction of the case's close warmed me more than any fire. Holmes sat silent for a time, then spoke softly. Every link accounted for, the chain complete. I nodded, still seeing the evidence laid out on that table, each piece gleaming under the gaslight. Holmes's method had bound the truth so tightly that even the guilty man could no longer deny it. Looking back, I should have recognized sooner how every detail, from the dry boots to the tarnished whistle, had pointed unerringly to one man. What final link struck you most forcibly, dear reader? Before the arrest, which piece of evidence sealed the chain for you? The hansom rattled on through the crisp streets, gas lamps beginning to glow as daylight faded. Every link accounted for. Bet the chain complete. Chapter 8. Justice in Chains. The morning following the confrontation at Scotland Yard dawned with a brittle clarity. The sky a pale, hard blue over London, the last remnants of autumn fog burned away by a cold sun. At 221B Baker Street, the coal fire had been stoked early, its steady crackle filling the sitting room with welcome warmth, while the air carried the familiar blend of Holmes's strong tobacco and the sharp scent of fresh coffee Mrs. Hudson brought up on a tray. I stood at the window, for a moment watching the street below, where hansoms clattered briskly over dry cobblestones, their wheels ringing clear in the crisp air, before turning back to Holmes, who sat at the table sorting the last of the case papers with quiet precision. Today the chain is drawn tight around the prisoner, he said, setting the documents aside. Lestrade has arranged the formal charging at the yard, We shall witness justice take its final hold." He rose, donned his Inverness and deerstalker, and we descended the 17 steps together, stepping out into the sharp chill that nipped at cheeks and fingers alike. The cab journey to Scotland Yard was swift, the horses' hooves striking sparks from the stones, the driver's whip cracking smartly above us. Inside the building, the corridors echoed with official footsteps, the air thick with the mingled smells of coal smoke from the heating stoves, carbolic disinfectant from the cells, and the faint metallic tang of ink and sealing wax. Lestrade met us near the entrance to the charge room, his face flushed from the cold outside, breath still visible as he spoke. "Crow's been processed," he said gruffly. "No trouble overnight. Quiet as a mouse once the fight went out of him. We'll do the formalities now. Magistrate's clerk is waiting." He led us down a short passage to a small, plainly furnished room where a narrow table stood beneath a single gas lamp. Crow sat there in manacles, head bowed, the rough fabric of his prison-issue coat hanging loose on his broad frame. 2 constables flanked him, their boots polished to a dull shine, while a clerk with wire spectacles prepared to record the proceedings. The door opened again, and Lady Thorpe entered quietly, accompanied by Miss Vance. They took seats along the wall, faces composed but pale. Perkins the valet had not been required to attend. His minor role was already documented and dismissed. The fire in the small grate crackled fitfully, its offering scant warmth against the chill that seemed to cling to the stone walls. Lestrade cleared his throat. "Elias Crow, you stand charged with the wilful murder of Sir Reginald Thorpe on the night of the 23rd of October last. The evidence having been presented and your own admissions made, do you have anything further to say before the charges entered?" Crow lifted his head slowly. His eyes, once sharp with calculation, now appeared dull and sunken. For a long moment he was silent, the only sound, the soft pop of coal settling in the grate, and the scratch of the clerk's pen on paper. Then he spoke, voice low and cracked. "I never planned it," he said. "Not like that. The debts, they grew too heavy. Reginald found the books, confronted me in the office, said he'd go to the authorities next morning. I panicked. The cyanide was there for rats in the warehouse. I put it in his coffee when he turned away, thought it would just make him ill. But he went quick. Too quick. Then I had to move him. The whistle. It was just to make them think it was something else. A ghost, anything but me." He stopped, shoulders sagging further, chains clinking faintly as he shifted. Lady Thorpe turned her face aside, a handkerchief pressed to her lips. Miss Vance sat very still, eyes fixed on the floor. Crow glanced toward them once, then away, as though the sight of their grief was too heavy to bear. The clerk finished writing, sanded the page, and passed it to Lestrade, who read it aloud in a flat official tone before asking Crow to sign. The man's hand shook as he took the pen. The signature came out uneven but legible. Lestrade folded the document and sealed it with wax, and nodded to the constables. "Take him below," he said quietly. Crow rose without protest. As the constables led him toward the door, he paused, turning once toward Holmes. "You saw it all," he muttered. "Every step, every lie. I thought the fog would hide me. It hid nothing from you." Holmes met his gaze without expression, offering no reply. The door closed behind them with a heavy thud, the sound echoing down the corridor like the fall of a final bar. Lady Thorpe stood, smoothing her skirts with careful hands. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes," she said softly, "for the truth, however painful. Reginald deserved justice, not superstition." She extended a gloved hand. Holmes took it briefly, inclining his head. Miss Vance rose also, offering a small, grateful smile. "The office will continue under new management," she said. "I shall see the accounts put right." They left together, footsteps fading along the passage. Lestrade turned to Holmes, rubbing the back of his neck. "You've tied it up neatly As always, the yard will note your assistance. Again, though I'll never hear the end of it from the superintendent. A rare half-smile touched his lips. The criminal bound. Justice served. We stepped out into the cold afternoon air, the sharp scent of frost mingling with coal smoke from nearby chimneys. A hansom waited at the curb. As we climbed in, the driver flicked the reins and the cab moved off smoothly, wheels rumbling over the stones. Inside, the leather seats were still cold, but the satisfaction of the case's close warmed me more than the weak sun. Holmes sat silent for a time, gazing out at the passing streets where gas lamps were already being lit against the early dusk. Then he spoke quietly. "The loose ends are tied. Lady Thorpe may rebuild her life without shadow. Miss Vance carries no stain of suspicion. Even Perkins returns to honest service. The chain has done its work." I nodded, still seeing Crow's defeated slump as he was led away, the clink of irons marking the end of his freedom. Holmes's logic had bound him so completely that resistance crumbled at the last. Looking back, I should have recognized sooner how the weight of his own past had pulled him down. What moment sealed justice for you, dear reader? When the chains clicked shut, or when the final admission fell? The hansom rattled on through the gathering twilight, carrying us home to Baker Street and the waiting fire. I'll end Chapter 9. Links restored. The days following Elias Crow's formal charging passed in a quiet, measured rhythm, the sharp winter light of London, now steady and unclouded, as though the city itself had drawn a relieved breath. At 221B Baker Street, the coal fire burned with its usual comforting crackle, filling the sitting room with warmth and the familiar scents of Holmes's strong tobacco and the faint bitterness of cooling tea left on the side table. I sat by the window one afternoon, watching the pale sun glint on the wet rooftops opposite, while Holmes stood at the mantel, pipe in hand, gazing thoughtfully into the flames. "The chain has done its work," he said quietly. "Now we watch as order is restored, link by link, to those it touched." He turned as Mrs. Hudson entered with the Morning Post, I laying a small stack of letters and newspapers on the table. Among them was an official envelope from Scotland Yard, sealed with red wax, and a personal note in Lady Thorpe's elegant hand. I opened the Yard's letter first. It confirmed the swift progress of the case. Crow had entered a formal plea of guilty at the preliminary hearing, sparing the family and the public a lengthy trial. The magistrate had committed him for sentencing at the Old Bailey in the coming week. The evidence, ledgers, whistle, cyanide traces, witness statements, was deemed overwhelming. Justice would be swift and certain. The note concluded with Lestrade's grudging thanks. "Your chain held firm, Holmes. The Yard won't forget it." Lady Thorpe's letter was briefer, yet warmer. She wrote from the Mayfair house, and where the heavy drapes had been drawn back to let in light for the first time in weeks. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," the note began, "the shadow has lifted. Reginald's will has been proved without contest. The estate passes cleanly to me and to the small bequests he intended. I have engaged new solicitors to review the warehouse accounts. Miss Vance has been invaluable in this. She will remain as manager under the restructured firm. Her loyalty, proven beyond doubt. Perkins has returned to service here. He carries no blame for messages he merely delivered. I intend to remarry in the spring. A quiet affair to a gentleman of steady character who knew Reginald in business. Life continues. Thanks to you both." I passed the letter to Holmes. He read it in silence, then folded it carefully and placed it on the mantel beside his violin. "Innocence restored," he murmured. "The chain that bound the guilty has freed the blameless." That same afternoon, we received a visit from Miss Amelia Vance herself. She arrived in a modest hansom, stepping down onto the pavement with brisk purpose, her coat brushed free of winter dust. Mrs. Hudson showed her up, the 17 steps, and soon she sat opposite us in the familiar armchair, a small parcel in her lap. The fire crackled softly, warming the room against the chill that still lingered outside. "I came to thank you in person," she said, voice steady. "The suspicion Even the whisper of it was unbearable. My scarf was indeed stolen. A maid at the warehouse confessed to taking it for resale, unaware of its connection to the crime. The firm continues under my supervision now. Sir Reginald's ledgers have been corrected. The embezzled sums will be recovered where possible, and the business placed on firmer footing. I owe my position and my good name to your work." Holmes inclined his head. "You owe it to the facts, Miss Vance. Facts do not lie when properly examined." She smiled faintly, then opened the parcel to reveal a small, finely bound volume, a collection of essays on logic and observation, newly published. "A token," she said. It seemed appropriate. We spoke for a time of practical matters, the warehouse reopening under stricter oversight, the dismissal of 2 clerks whose complicity in minor irregularities had come to light during the audit, the quiet gratitude of the staff who had feared for their livelihoods. When she rose to leave, the light caught her face, and I saw the lines of strain finally easing from around her eyes. As the door closed behind her, Holmes returned to the window, watching the hansom pull away into the flow of traffic. "Futures indicated," he said softly. "Lady Thorpe finds companionship again. Miss Vance rises in responsibility. Even the warehouse, once shadowed by deceit, returns to honest trade. The ripples of one crime subside, and London resumes its ordinary pulse." I joined him at the window. Below, the street moved with its usual life, hansoms clattering, pedestrians hurrying against the cold, a link boy calling out the latest editions with news of parliamentary debates and distant colonial affairs. The gas lamps were not yet lit, but the pale winter sun still held, casting long, clean shadows across the cobblestones. That evening, the newspapers carried brief, factual accounts of the case's conclusion. De Crow's guilty plea was noted without sensation. The public had already turned its attention to fresher scandals. The Banshee of London Bridge, once whispered about in fog-bound taverns, faded back into folklore, no longer a harbinger of death, but merely an odd footnote in a solved murder. The river continued its slow, dark flow beneath the arches, carrying away the last echoes of superstition. Back in our sitting room, the fire burned low, its embers glowing softly. Holmes took up his violin, fingers moving absently over the strings, drawing out a slow, contemplative air that filled the quiet space. I poured brandy from the tantalus, its sweet warmth spreading through me as I settled into my chair. The rough leather creaked beneath me, familiar and comforting. Looking back over the weeks, I marveled at how completely the disorder had been righted. Where there had been suspicion and grief, now stood clarity and renewal. Lady Thorpe would walk the rooms of her house without fear. Miss Vance would oversee ledgers untainted by forgery. The innocent parties, freed by logic, could look forward without shadow. Even the city seemed to breathe more easily, its fogs and secrets no match for relentless reason. Holmes set the violin down at last, steepling his fingers under his chin. "Order restored," he said quietly, "to London streets." I raised my glass in silent agreement. The chain that had bound a killer had also freed the living, link by careful link. What greater satisfaction could deduction offer? The fire settled into a steady glow, and outside the winter night deepened. Gas lamps flickering on one by one along Baker Street, steady beacons in the dark, order restored to London streets. Chapter 10. By the fire at Baker Street, the case of the Banshee of London Bridge had closed, and a quiet calm settled over 221B Baker Street as the winter deepened into early December. The coal fire burned with a steady, contented glow in the grate, its warmth spreading through the sitting room like a gentle tide, driving back the chill that pressed against the window panes. Outside, a light snow had begun to fall, soft flakes drifting past the gas lamps and settling on the cobblestones below with barely a sound. Inside, the air carried the rich scent of Holmes's tobacco from the Persian slipper, mingled with the faint sweetness of brandy warming in the glasses on the table between us. Holmes sat in his usual armchair, the long legs stretched toward the hearth, violin resting across his knees. He plucked a few idle notes, slow, reflective, while I settled opposite, the worn leather creaking comfortably beneath me. The day's newspapers lay folded on the side table, headlines already turning to fresher matters, a diplomatic note from Berlin, the latest cricket scores from Australia. Our adventure had slipped quietly from the public eye, as such things often do once the truth is known. I poured us each a measure of brandy, the liquid catching the firelight in amber depths. "It is done," I said, raising my glass. "Crow sentenced this morning, penal servitude for life. The papers scarcely mention it now." Holmes set the violin aside and accepted the glass, turning it slowly in his fingers. As it should be. The chain served its purpose and is now put away. And no need for further display. He took a sip, the sweet burn lingering on his tongue, then leaned back, steepling his fingers under his chin in that familiar attitude of contemplation. For a time, we sat in companionable silence, the fire crackling softly, the snow muffling the distant clatter of hansoms and the occasional shout of a link boy. At length, Holmes spoke, voice low and thoughtful. "The chain method, Watson, is nothing more than disciplined observation carried to its logical end. Each fact, a dry boot, an uneven print, a tarnished whistle, is a link, seemingly isolated. Yet, when examined without prejudice, each connects to the next through reason alone. Forge the connections patiently, test them rigorously, and the chain grows unbreakable. Deception, whether a staged accident, a ghostly wail, or a forged ledger, relies on distraction, on the human tendency to accept the obvious and ignore the discordant detail. The science of deduction defeats it by refusing to be distracted. Every anomaly must be explained. Every link must fit." He paused, eyes fixed on the flames. "Consider the Hound of the Baskervilles. There, too, a spectral terror was manufactured, phosphorus paint, a trained beast, timed howls across the moor, to conceal a very human crime of inheritance and greed. The chain began with a single footprint in soft earth, larger and stranger than any natural hound's. From that small observation flowed the rest. The legend exploited, the family history unearthed, the criminal's motive laid bare. Superstition crumbled before logic, just as the Banshee illusion crumbled here. In both cases, the past provided the key. The hound's lineage traced to a bought animal, Crow's youth spent forging signals and skimming profits. Observation defeats deception because the deceiver cannot erase every trace. The earth, the paper, the metal remembers. The detective has only to listen." I nodded, slowly, the brandy warm in my throat. "And yet, so many miss those traces. Even I, at times." Holmes smiled faintly, a rare softening of his sharp features. "You see them, Watson, but you do not always forge the connections at once. That is no failing. It is human. My advantage, if it may be called one, is habit. Relentless, mechanical habit of noticing the incongruous and pursuing it without mercy. Data, data, data. I cannot make bricks without clay. But once the clay is gathered, the structure rises inevitably. In this affair, the dry boots were the first brick, the limp the second, the whistle the keystone. Eliminate the impossible, accident, suicide, ghostly intervention, and what remains, however improbable, must be the truth, a calculated murder rooted in greed and panic." He reached for his pipe, packed it thoughtfully from the slipper, and lit it with a spill from the fire. The tobacco's rich aroma filled the room, blending with the coal smoke and the faint scent of old books on the shelves. Why does observation triumph? Because the world is consistent. A boot cannot be both wet and dry at once. A limp cannot vanish when convenient. A whistle cannot shriek without air passing through it. The criminal forgets, or hopes we will forget, that nature and physics do not conspire to aid deceit. They testify impartially. Our task is merely to record their testimony accurately. The fire settled lower, embers glowing like quiet stars. Holmes drew on his pipe, smoke curling upward in slow spirals. This case was modest in scale compared to some, a single merchant, a warehouse fraud, a riverside disposal. Yet the principle remains the same. A trifling detail, properly pursued, binds the guilty as surely as iron chains. The Banshee was meant to terrify and obscure. Instead, it betrayed. The fog was meant to hide. Instead, it preserved the prince. Reason turns every attempt at concealment into evidence. I set my glass down, the warmth lingering in my palms, until the next puzzle presents itself. Holmes inclined his head. Precisely. London never lacks for shadows nor for those who cast them. But so long as there are eyes willing to see and minds willing to connect, the game continues. He rose, crossed to the window, and stood looking out at the snow falling steadily now, gas lamps haloed in soft white. The street below moved with muffled life, hansoms passing like ghosts, pedestrians hurrying home against the cold. Inside, the fire popped once, sending a small shower of sparks up the chimney. I joined him at the window, watching the flakes drift and settle. Holmes spoke without turning. Final wisdom, then, to any who follow these pages: observe keenly, question relentlessly, connect fearlessly. The smallest incongruity may be the thread that unravels the whole. Trust the facts. They do not lie. And when the chain is forged, link by link, test by test, truth emerges, steady and unyielding. He turned back to the room, his eyes catching the firelight with that peculiar gleam I knew so well. Until the next chain forges, dear listener, the game continues. The snow fell on, silent and relentless, while the fire burned low and steady, and Baker Street settled into the quiet of a winter evening.